Today's daf we're going to be learning is Nedarim, daf Yud. Today's daf is sponsored by Sarah Borelowitz in loving memory of her father, Tzvi ben Moshe, on his 14th year at site. And today's daf is sponsored by Risa Zohar in loving memory of her grandmother, Rose Schwartz Whittles. We're now going to get started with our daf. Let's just review where we were up to. We started with this Mishna yesterday. Kinidre Rishaim Nadar ben Nazir ubekorban b'shvua. We had a neder of Rishaim, of people who do wrongdoings, as opposed to nidrei cherem. If you say nidrei cherem, that's nothing, because nedarim generally are not said by kosher people, which means good people. Kinidvotam, but if you say like the nedava of a kasher person, then it's valid nadar ben nazir ubekorban. We wanted to distinguish what's the difference between a neder and a nedava. Right. Again, we can translate it a vow versus a voluntary or gift offering. But the question is, why is this a difference? And why would kasher people do one or the other? Because theoretically, both are types of vows and commitments and promises. So the Gemara, instead of asking the question that way, really, what's the difference? They asked, who does this go according to? And they quoted a braita with Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda, where Rabbi Meir says, better not to ever make a vow at all. And therefore, anyone who makes a vow is basically not a good person. And Rabbi Yehuda said, well, it is good if you take a vow and you keep to your word. So if you notice, Rabbi Meir is problematic because he says vows are always bad. So how could we have a nedava that would be good? And Rabbi Yehuda says vows are actually good if you keep your vow. So that really doesn't seem to match the Mishna. So Rabbi Meir, we explained very simply by saying, well, vows aren't good. That's neder. But if it was a nedava, theoretically it could be good. And then we brought two proofs, by korban, one by nazir. We had the story of Hillel as a king, how we would bring in a dove in a very careful manner that would ensure, and he would tell people to do it like that, to ensure that there be no problem of do it right in the temple, then there won't be any delay, and you'll bring it right away. As opposed to a neder, which theoretically the animal could die, and then you'll still might end up being delayed, and then you could have the issue of you might never keep your promise, or you might delay your bringing your promise to the temple. Then we had the example of nazir. We saw Shimon the Tzadik, who basically said, I don't like nazirim at all. I think it's bad. But there's one nazir who did it for the right reasons. And most people become a nazir for the wrong reasons. I was very impressed with this one nazir I saw who did it for the right reason. And that would be the difference between a neder and a nedava, kind of the intent and doing it for the right reasons, l'shem Shammai, as we said. That was our explanation according to Rabbi Meir. Now the Gemara is going to say, Beit ema, afilu tema Rabbi Yehuda. Now the Gemara says, alternatively, you could say, I can even explain it according to Rabbi Yehuda, who was more difficult to explain according to, because Rabbi Yehuda clearly said the neder could be a good thing, right? If you keep your vow, then that's good. So kinidrei cherem should theoretically work. So what are they going to answer? Ki amar Rabbi Yehuda benedava beneder lo amar. When he said that it's good to take a vow and keep your vow, he really wasn't talking about a vow. He was talking about a nedava, to which the Gemara asked the obvious question, the best of all is, as opposed to someone who takes a vow and doesn't keep it or something like that, the best of all is someone who takes a vow and keeps it. Well, he used the language of neder, not nedava. So how can you say he meant nedava when he said neder? Which we had a question about that yesterday in Rabbi Meir, a little bit different kind of question, but same thing about the language of the Mishna didn't work. To which they answered, Tanei nodev u'makayim. Change the wording. Say that instead of nodel, it's nodev. We talked about this yesterday, that it's changing of one letter and the last sound in the word. It's definitely possible those could have gotten confused. Here, it's more difficult to say that. In the Mishnah, it was a little bit easier. In the braita, the whole topic was from a verse talking about nedarim, but still, you could say, right, Kohelet basically said, it's not good. Better not to take a vow than to take a vow and not to keep it. So we understood Rabbi Yehuda is saying, but if you take the vow and keep it, it's good. Well, now they come to say, no, really, taking vows is no good, like the verse seems to indicate. But right, they didn't talk about what if you take a vow and keep it. So maybe taking a vow and keeping it isn't good. But if you were to take a nedava, that would be good. Again, it's not really the simple reading, but that's what the Gemara does. They take readings and suggest other possible readings that could work. So now, again, we have the same question we had according to Rabbi Meir, which is, Mishna noder delo. Well, What's the issue with a neder? What's wrong with a neder? What was clear from the verse? What's wrong with a neder? You might not keep your vow. You might have an issue of bal ta'achir. You'll delay bringing it, and you'll bring it beyond the time you were supposed to be bringing it. Nedavanami, same thing. Also have a problem, a takala with a nedava. There should be no difference. And it's clear from the Mishna there's a difference in how we can explain. Now, we're going to start off similar to the previous answer when we asked this question of Rabbi Meir. The main difference is that with Rabbi Meir, we didn't have any statements of Rabbi Meir that alluded to any of these differences. So therefore, they took sources that seemed to relate, that were kind of in other people's words or other people's situations, like what Shimon the Tzadik did and what he said and what Hillel Hazaken would tell people to do. But in this case, we're going to have an easier way to come up with an answer because we're going to answer for both, which both means we have to explain by korban, and then we're going to have to explain by nazir. Rabbi Yehuda l'ta'ameh, Rabbi Yehuda is consistent within his approach because da'amal, in other places, we're going to see things that Rabbi Yehuda said. So Rabbi Yehuda said the following. Adam mivi kivsato la'azara u'makdisha. This is very much like Hillel Hazaken. Rabbi Yehuda said the same thing that Hillel Hazaken would suggest to people to do. Now, the difference is Rabbi Yehuda wasn't living in the time of the temple. Hillel Hazaken was, so Hillel Hazaken was kind of telling people this is what you should do. Rabbi Yehuda was kind of explaining the ideal way to do things when there's a temple, which is Adam mivi kivsato la'azara. Bring your sheep to the temple. U'makdisha, and only sanctify it when you're there, exactly as we saw Hillel Hazaken. Then you do the smicha on the korban, b'shochatan, then you slaughter it, and then everything's done immediately, and that's a nedava, when you do it in a way that you're protecting yourself from coming lidei takala, as they say, for having some issue that you're going to get stuck. Tinach nedava de korbanot. As we said yesterday when we brought Hillel Hazaken, same thing here. When it's a nedava of a sacrifice, okay, I get the distinction. You just explained it. But nedava de nazirut ma'yikalamemar. But how are you going to explain nedava by nazirut? So here we're going to have a different kind of answer. It's a similar type answer, but it's not from the same type source. We're not talking about this one particular nazir that he found. But again, Rabbi Yehuda l'ta'ameh, Rabbi Yehuda is going to be consistent within his approach that there are nazirim who take it upon themselves for the right reasons. It's just going to be a different reason than we saw yesterday. Ditan. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Chasidim harishonim, the very interesting line. Hayu mitavim lahavi korban chatat. The early Chasidim really, really wanted to bring a korban chatat. Now, why? Korban chatat is a sin offering. But we talked about the fact that there's 613 mitzvot. Now, we all know that no single person can do all 613 mitzvot. Okay, the simplest is that some are for kohanim and some are for non-kohanim. So if you're a Kohen, you can't do certain things. If you're not a Kohen, you can't do all the Kohen mitzvot. There is no such thing. Aren't 613 mitzvot that relate to every person. All right, you kind of feel like it would be interesting to try out all the mitzvot, be involved in all the mitzvot, but you can't really do that. So the Hasidim said, we really want to see what it's like to bring a korban chatat. So korban chatat is generally brought if you do a sin accidentally, you didn't realize. So theoretically, maybe they could have done that, but they say the following: but they never really got to a korban chatat. They never accidentally did a sin because God protected them. Okay, God wouldn't allow any sort of accidents to happen to them. They were kind of in a protected area by God, and therefore didn't have an opportunity to bring a sin offering. So what would they do? They would become a nazir, because a nazir, one of the sacrifices the nazir brings, we talked about this, right? The two kind of exceptions to the rule of chatat are really not brought because of a sin, although we're going to discuss that today, which is the nazir and the yoledet, a woman who gives birth. Right? You could have said they could have tried to bring a korban yoledet, right? But that was, even if they had their wives get pregnant and they brought it on behalf of their wives, that still wasn't their own korban, right? It was their wives. So they wanted to bring themselves. So what would they do? They would basically say, I'll become a nazir, and then I'll be able to bring a sin offering. Then, so Rabbi Yehuda viewed that as a very positive thing. This is a way of them wanting to get involved in understanding, seeing how korban chatat works, being able to do it themselves, trying to have the opportunity to do as many mitzvot as they can. So that's a nedava. Rabbi Shimon, as opposed to, we saw yesterday, the way Rabbi Shimon's approach, Shimon the Tzadik is very against the nazirim who do it out of, a moment of anger or confusion, and I'm just going to become a nazir. Stop eating and stop eating grapes, stop drinking wine, etc. Rabbi Shimon Omer, lo nedru. Now, that's the answer. So we're done with this explanation. The difference is, again, it's very similar to the way we understood Rabbi Meir. It's really in how you do it. Okay, that there's ways to become a nazir in a positive way, and that's what a nedava of a nazir is. That's nazirut cherem, right? Kinidvatam. But since we brought this braita, the Gemara always, I guess, in the same way, the Hasidim of Rishonim wanted to get to everything in the Chatat. The Gemara likes to bring up everything that comes up. So, since we were in this braita, which had this interesting approach, we're now going to see an opposite approach, and this is the continuation of that braita. So they don't miss an opportunity to teach you something interesting. And this is really at the crux of both neder and nedarim and nazirut and all of this, the concept of, is it a good thing or is it a bad thing? So Rabbi Shimon Omer, lo nadru b'nazir, ela harotze lavi ola mitnadev umevi, shlamim mitnadev umevi, toda v'arba minei lachma mitnadev umevi, aval b'nazirut lo itnadvu. Okay, we'll stop mid-sentence for a minute, but just so I can explain, because I read a little bit too much, but I wanted to kind of get there. Basically, what Rabbi Shimon says is there's no such thing as lindor b'nazirut for a good reason. He says, because if you want to be a korban ola, you can offer it as voluntary offering. It says in the Torah, right? If you want to bring it, you can bring it as a voluntary offering. That's a burnt offering. If you want to bring a peace offering, you can volunteer and bring that. If you want to bring a korban toda, Thanksgiving offering that comes with 4 types of different breads, you can do that. But nazirut lo itnadvu, and now we're going to see why. But there's no volunteering to be a nazir, kedei shelo yikaru chotim, because a nazir is called a sinner. So you wouldn't want to put yourself in a situation where we're going to call you a sinner. How do we know a nazir is called a sinner? And here, this is a good example of taking things out of context. Shenema v'chiper ala me'asher chatal nefesh. It says there, this is a good example of, you have to open the psukim inside. It says there, v'chiper ala me'asher chatal nefesh. Now, it says he does chatat, right? Me'asher chatal nefesh, because he sinned. Now, what's the context of this verse? The context of this verse is when a nazir becomes impure. Okay, so we're going to get back to this. A nazir becomes impure, makes sense, he's called a sinner. But Rabbi Shimon says every nazir is called a sinner, right? Because a nazir becomes impure to a dead person and then has to go through nazirut again and has to go through a process. It's true he sinned unwittingly, but anyway, a chatat is brought for unwitting sins, and he's called a sinner because he did something wrong, because he broke his nazirut. But that's not the same as a nazir being a chotei. He takes it out of context and says, no, this shows all nazirim are called chotim. So no chasidim would want to put themselves in a situation where they're going to be called a sinner. So Amar Abaye, we're going to understand this a little better in a minute, even though we're kind of done with Rabbi Shimon. Shimon the Tzadik, we saw yesterday, who was also very against nazirim. He did say, I found this one nazir, but otherwise he wanted to have nothing to do with nazirim. He didn't want to eat the meat of their sacrifices. Rabbi Shimon, who we just saw now, Rabbi Elazar the Kapar, who we're going to see in a minute, Kulan shita achaten de nazir choteha. They all view nazirut, and I would say it in this way, as a negative thing. And they viewed, therefore, anyone who took upon nazirut was a sinner. So Shimon the Tzadik for Rabbi Shimon, Hadamaran, we already saw their opinions. Rabbi Elazar the Kapar beRebbi, okay, that means he was an important rabbi. Okay, beRebbi sometimes means the son of Rebbe. Here it means an important rabbi. Okay, Rabbi Elazar the Kapar, he was one of the last, in the last generation of Tanaim. He's also the teacher of Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi, who we see a lot in the Gemara. Ditanya, here's the braita, and here's his opinion. He is very famous for this. Rabbi Elazar the Kapar beRebbi Omer, v'chiper alav me'asher chatal nefesh. To which the Gemara says, let's understand this pasuk of Rabbi Elazar the Kapar says, sorry, not the Gemara, the braita. V'chi be'ezo nefesh chatal zeh. What was his sin? His sin was that he had to abstain from drinking wine. They do not view this as a positive thing. This is what we discussed in the beginning of the Masechet about vows not being viewed as positive. The Torah, many people understand it like this, the Torah forbids enough things. It's not our job to start forbidding more things upon ourselves. It's not a positive thing. Our Our role in Judaism is not to abstain from everything, right? That's not our approach. And to which the braita continues, if this person only refrained from drinking wine, and we call him a sinner. If somebody decides I'm not eating anything, all the more so will he be a sinner. From here we derive, if you decide to sit and fast all day, right, you take upon yourselves unnecessary fasts, that's not viewed as a good thing. Okay, so even though Judaism has fasts in the calendar for various reasons, our role is not to start adding more things. So there's two concepts here really, which is number one, right? Don't go and forbid more things that are forbidden, right? You could derive from here, don't be extra stringent about things, or just don't go adding more prohibitions on yourself. Number two, a little bit like we talked about, that God, right? The Torah is God-given. God gave us all these commandments, and it's not our role almost to kind of almost play God and say that we're going to forbid more things than God did, right? It's almost like we're trying to play God, and that's not a good thing either. Okay, so now the Gemara asks the final question on this before we move on, which is, Haden krab nazir tamektiv. They finally ask it directly, but the verse you're using is about a nazir that became impure, not a regular nazir. So if we're assuming that this is referring to a regular nazir, why didn't it appear by the verses of a regular nazir, and yet it only appeared by a nazir who became impure? To which they answer, Mishum deshana b'chetu. Really belonged anywhere in Nizirut, but since there he sinned by doing two things, they mention the sinning in that verse rather than mentioning it in the regular verse. Okay, again, that's their approach. Not everybody thinks that every nazir is a sinner, but this is an approach about Nizirut. So it's very important to understand, like in many things in Judaism, there's at least two approaches, right? In this case, there's two approaches. Is it a good thing? Again, anyone who thinks it's a good thing, still in modification, right? Not always is it a good thing. Has to be done l'shem Shammai, not for some other reason. So could be a good thing. It could be a bad thing. The other approach is it's always bad. Don't take upon yourself. Don't become a nazir. It's not a positive thing. So again, always important to know this isn't the only opinion, but there are opinions that say. Okay, next. Now we're going to start a Mishna. We finally get back to something we talked about in the very beginning about kinui. So we started with kinui, we moved to yadot. Remember, that was the whole thing about the chiastic structure. Why is it A, B, B, A? Here we're finally getting to the A. We're getting back to kinui nedarim, and what are kinui nedarim? So ha'omer konam, konach, konas, hare'elu kinuyim lekorban. So someone says the words konam, konach, konas, that's a kinui for a korban. These words, you might say, what do these words mean? Okay, these actually are familiar words to you, and you know why they're familiar to you? From kol nidre, because kol nidre is based on this Mishna. Kol nidre v'yasarei v'charame v'cherem, right? V'kinuye v'kinusei, kinusei, right? That's this. Okay, kinuye is the kinuyim. Koname v'kinusei, okay? All those words, konam, right? Konas, kinusei, that all comes from here. Okay, those are all, so next year when you say kol nidre, you're going to see all these words, you're going to say, oh, I know those words. That's what we learned in Nedarim. Okay, so konam, konach, konas. So these are not normal Hebrew words, just so you know. Okay, if Hebrew is not a familiar language to you, these are not normal Hebrew words. Again, these kind of became Hebrew words because of this Mishnah, but they're not really regular Hebrew words, and that's going to cause a whole bunch of lack of clarity about where these words came from. So those are kinuyim for korban. These are, maybe those words are in use, these are really not. Cherek, cherech, cherech. Hare'elu kinuyim lecherem. Okay, now these really look korban, at least they're a little, now they're all with kuf, but they're not exactly, other than the kuf, the first words aren't really similar to korban. These are cherem with a switch of a letter, okay, right? There's a kuf, a chaf sofid, and a pei sofid instead of a mem sofid. Nazik, naziach, paziach, hare'elu kinuyim lenizirut. Okay, nazik is a switch of a letter. Naziach is also a switch of a letter. But then paziach is sort of a takeoff on naziach, right? Switches a letter of the nun to the pei. Hare'elu kinuyim lenizirut. These are all other ways of saying nazir. Shivuta shekuka, noder b'mohi, hare'elu kinuyim l'shvua. Okay, shvua, shvuta, yes, that's similar. Shkuka is already a little more distant, but also has the shin in it. Noder b'mohi is the strange language. which seems to indicate, we'll see later, it's like someone who's neder. Many people think Mohi is Moshe Rabbeinu. Okay, so Moshe Rabbeinu apparently took an oath to Yitro when he comes. If you look in chapter 2 of Sefer Shemot, verse 21, it says, Vayoam Moshe consented to stay with Yitro. And then they seem to infer from there that because Vayoel is a lashon of Allah, which is a shvu'ah, that he must have sworn to him. So they say, like neder, like Moshe, is a shvu'ah, because Moshe took us an oath then. Okay, this is very strange. We're going to have to understand. I can't promise you that you're not going to find the rest of this a little bit strange, okay? Especially when we get toward the end of this Mishnah, the explanation of this Mishnah, we're going to get to kinui. We're going to get on to very random words. It's a little bit hard to understand, and we're going to see that they also struggle to understand it. So the first thing the Gemara does is bring a machlok and a moraim, which we reference to in the very beginning of our Masechet. Itmar kinuyim, Rabbi Yochanan amar lashon umotein. This is the language of other nations. Okay, these are words for the same thing in other languages. Rabbi Shimon Lakish omer lashon shabadu lahem chachamim liot neder bo. No, this is a made-up word by the rabbis to be similar to the word itself, but not the same. We're going to have to see in the Gemara why they did this. But before we get into why, let's just try to understand these two. Much has been written on the differences between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish and what they mean and how and etc. So the first thing is, some of the commentaries view both Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish as struggling with where these words came from. Okay, so if you take Rabbi Yochanan is simple reading, Rabbi Yochanan is saying, this is how you say korban in a different language. Okay, the problem is that it's not so clear that that's the case. Otherwise, Reish Lakish would have agreed with him. Like if naziach meant nazir or paziach, right? Then in some other language, then it would have made sense. But the Amoraim, again, living somewhere differently, and the people around them were different. They didn't understand that word. So they got into this argument. The truth is, Reish Lakish was actually living in Israel, so was Rabbi Yochanan. But still, there was time had passed, and therefore could be the language changed, and they didn't recognize this anymore as lashon umot. Rabbi Yochanan said, "Must be this was the language of the people then." And Reish Lakish says, "No, not at all. It must be the rabbis changed the language." Now, according to the Ran understands. It's an interesting approach that both Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan realize that we've kind of taken this word and changed one letter or changed a few letters or something like that. And so Reish Lakish fits in perfectly with that, because the rabbis kind of changed a letter or two in order to, we'll see why, okay? They did that on purpose. And it's not a real word. That fits in very nicely with the fact that this doesn't look like a real word. The way the Ran understands Rabbi Yochanan is that also it's not a real word. It's not really lashon umot. What is it? The umot messed up our language. Like they kind of took words from our language, but didn't pronounce them correctly, didn't say them right, and it came out like this. And it's not a real language. Okay, now, first of all, what's the strength of saying this? Because if it was a real language, if I say, okay, we're all speaking in English now. So if I say, I take on myself a vow, I don't say the word neder, I say a vow. Is that a kinui of a neder? Not really, that's a neder. I took on a vow, I just said it in a different language. So Rabbi Yochanan, if he says it's lashon umot, well then first of all, the Mishna shouldn't tell you konam konach konas. The Mishna should say, haomer neder b'chol lashon. Okay, if you say neder in any language, just like there's all these Mishnayot that talk about, can you say Shema in any language? Can you read the Megillah in any language? Right? There's all sorts of questions about what can be done in any language and what can't be done, what has to be done in Lashon HaKodesh. That doesn't seem to be what they're discussing here. So, and kinui might have a different status than the neder itself. So if I just say vow in English, that should be a neder, not a kinui of a neder. So the strength of the Ran is that he's basically saying, we're not talking about translation in another language. We're talking about a language that the Gentiles took from us and messed up and pronounced it incorrectly. Well, since the Gentiles use that language, so that could count as a kinui of a neder. Which is interesting. I mean, again, there's many different approaches really to understanding it. Tosfot says, right, the Ri actually says that im yehei kilashon, right, sorry. The Ri actually says what I just said about that. If it's like their language, then it's actually a neder, okay? And that he adds this other thing, which is very interesting. Why, if I say I vow to do something in English, is it definitely going to count? Because neder is all about what did I mean when I said what I meant. So what the Tosfot says is the chiddush about these languages, and there's three categories. I say neder b'ivrit in that language. Okay, clearly that's a ned. If I say it in another language, like I vow I'm going to do something, that's also a ned. Maybe a kinui, maybe a neder, okay? Unclear according to Re. But what the Re says is, if I say konach, konas, konam, one of those words, and I don't actually understand what I'm saying, okay? Let's say I said it, but I don't really know what I mean. Now, normally for a neder, I need to understand. What the Mishna is telling you is if you use this language, this counts, whether or not you understand what you mean. The Rashba jumps on this and says, how could this possibly be? Because if you don't understand what you mean, how could it be a neder? Okay, but that's what Tosfot says, and then people try to understand Tosfot. I'm not going to get so far off the daf, but the Re is one of the main Baalei Tosfot team. Okay, there's Rabbanit and the Re. They're the two main Baalei Tosfot. I'm not going to get into who they are. You could go look them up. Okay, now, so this is already very unclear, and there's many different ways of understanding this machloka between them. There's all sorts of nafkaminas of practical ramifications, whether you say one or the other, right? If you say it's lashon ha'um, right? I'm trying to avoid other nafkaminas, right? Okay, so right, if you say, right, there's another important nafkamina. I actually discussed this in the beginning of the Masechet, which is if you say it's lashon shabadu lahem chachamim, the rabbis made up a language so as not to use the real language of korban and all that. There's a debate among the Rishonim whether a kinui is derive or rabbanit. Is part of the reason that they used a different language, even though we're going to see the reason why they used a different language, but maybe there's an added element that doesn't say so in the Gemara, which is we don't want you to take on a neder by Torah law. So they change the language to say use this instead so that your neder will have less severity. Okay, so that if you don't keep it, it's not so severe. Some people say, no, it's the oraita, okay? It's the same, it has the same status. So that's also that's a whole machloket within Reish Lakish. Whereas if you're saying it's lashon umot, a language that other nations use, then it does, right? Then basically it'll be a neder by a Torah level. Another nafkamina is if you say it's lashon ha'umot, and let's say you live in America and you use the word konam. Now you don't know any Gentiles there that use konam. It's not the regular language used, so it won't be a neder because that's not a regular language used. But if you're in if you hold by Reish Lakish and you say this is the language the rabbis instituted and you use the word konam in America, it will be a problem. Okay, so there you have this understanding of like another nafkamina, whether you say it's lashon umot. Lashon umot is just saying that's the language people use here, so that's obviously what you meant. Okay, again, it all depends on how you understand it. If you go by Tosfot, like we said, anyway, this is all. There's a lot of lack of clarity here. So if you're a little confused, don't worry. It's very confusing. I'm trying to just kind of put out there a bunch of different approaches to understanding. Okay, next. This is a bit of a strange line. Also, because now the Gemara is going to explain the wording used by Reish Lakish. Okay, there seems to be an over-obsession of our language here. He used this word badu lahem chachamim. Where do we get the word badu? That they made up. Where do we see the word made up? Maybe they want to specifically make a reference to this also, which is a very strange reference in this context. Because we just said the rabbis made up something, and as if like that's an okay thing. They quote someone who made something up who really wasn't an okay thing, and that's Yeravam ben Nevat. After the split of the Malchut between Beit David, right, and after Shlomo, Rechavam versus Yeravam tries to make a temple to parallel the temple, and he basically makes up a holiday. He says, we're going to celebrate the holiday in the 8th month instead of the 7th month, so the people will come to his temple after they've gone to the temple on the 7th month in the regular temple. In the month that he created on his own. Okay, so basically, and he makes a chag on a new month. So there you see, Bada is made up. Now the Gemara says, Vitam, the question you've been waiting for. Vitam, Abaye takinu Rabbanin kinui. If you hold like Reish Lakish, the rabbis made up this language. Why did they make up this language? Dilo lema korban, because they didn't want you to say the word korban. That didn't really help us. The lema korban. What's wrong with saying korban? The Gemara asks. Dilma amar korban Hashem. Maybe you'll say korban Hashem the way it appears in the Torah. It's korban Hashem. Second verse in Vayikra. So they say, Okay, Vilema Korban Lashem. What's wrong with saying Korban Lashem? Dilma Amar Lashem Velo Amar Korban. We're worried that you might just say the word Lashem and you won't say Korban. And you'll end up using God's name in vain. This goes back to, we had all those things about how severe it is to basically use God's name in vain. Now it's all the background. It was kind of prepped to get to this moment where we now talk about why the rabbis changed the wording. They didn't want you to say Korban because they were worried you would say Korban Lashem. Okay. Also, nazir Lashem, it appears in the Torah, and right, this neder to bring with Hashem. So they didn't want those words to come. They were worried if you said Korban, you would also say Lashem, and you might come to say Lashem by itself, and that would be using God's name in vain. Bitanya. Further braita about this, Rabbi Shimon Omer, now going to Amud Bet, Minayin shelo yomar adam laHashem olah, laHashem mincha, laHashem todah, laHashem shlamim. When you want to bring a korban, don't say the wording, to God will be an olah, to God will be a todah, to God will be a shlamim, etc. You should Talmud lomar korban laHashem. Pasuk specifically said, I'll read you the verse, in the second verse in Sefer Vayikra. I'm reading from the middle. Adam ki akriv mikem korban laHashem, a person who brings a korban to God. Now you could have said, person who brings to God a korban. Could have said it that way as well. Because korban Hashem, to teach you, if you are going to use the word korban and Hashem, you should say korban la Hashem and not la Hashem korban. Why is that? Because you might end up saying la Hashem, and then you might change your mind about the korban, and then you'll never finish your sentence, and you'll have used God's name in vain. So always start with korban, and then add la Hashem after, so you don't waste, right, and accidentally end up using God's name in vain. So now they say kavachomer. Here we're going to make a kavachomer out of this. Right? Someone who really wanted to just say, I want to bring a korban, and we say to them, well, switch the order, be very careful not to accidentally use God's name in vain. Like what, right? All the more so, that's kavachomer, right? This, which is not so severe, think about when it's more severe. Someone who just uses God's name in vain, that must be way more serious. Okay, so it's trying to show you the seriousness of using God's name in vain. And that's why now we finally understand, why did they use korban? Because they didn't want you to accidentally say korban laHashem or nazir laHashem. They didn't want you to say God's name and maybe use it in vain. Lema kitzana. Now the daf gets a little bit strange. This part's not so crazy, but soon we're going to get to explaining what this really means. And what we're going to talk about kinuyim, and they're going to give you all sorts of examples of what kinuyim are. If you thought the words in the Mishna were weird, we're now going to get to even more weird words, which is a kinui on a kinui. But anyway, right, that's a sugya that's a little hard to understand what to do with it. But anyway, right now we're going to suggest that maybe the machloket Reish Lakish Rabbi Yochanan is based on the same, on about machloket Tanaim many generations before them, between Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel. Beit Shammai omrim kinuyim asurim. A kinui on a kinui is permitted according to Beit Hillel, but it's forbidden according to Beit Shammai. Now, my love, we not say Manda Amar kinui salim kasavar kinuyim lashonu motim. If you say they're forbidden like Beit Shammai, you'll hold like Rabbi Yochanan must hold like that. If you say it's language of the Gentiles, then you say, well, a kinui on a kinui will be language that other Gentiles use for the words of the Gentiles, right? So we have our words, we have Gentiles who use different words instead, and then we have other Gentiles who use other words instead of those words. So if you say it's going to be forbidden, it makes sense because they all, in essence, mean the same thing. It's just a matter of your language. Ulamanda amar mutarim kasavar lashon shabadu lahem chachamim. And if you say they're permitted, then you say, well, a kinui is a language the rabbis created, but a kinui and a kinui is already not. Okay, now what it is it a language the rabbis created in place of those words? Then already maybe it's too distant, or maybe it's a synonym for those words. But since those words were made up anyway, it's only the made up words that are relevant here. And then you'd say it's permitted. To which the Gemara says, "Lo, that's not the machloket Beit Shammai Beit Hillel. You misunderstood." Or again, this is just offering possibilities. It's a possibility, but they suggest other possibilities. Suggest another two possibilities. De kule alma, both Beit Shammai Beit Hillel hold the kinuyim lashon umotim. They're languages of the Gentiles. Beit Shammai saval bahane nami mishtay umot. Ubeit Hillel savra bahane lo mishtay umot. The debate is really a kinui of a kinui. This is hard to understand because we don't really understand what a kinui of a kinui is. So what they're suggesting is maybe a kinui is a language that the Gentiles speak. And Beit Shammai hold a kinui is also a language that they speak, like some variation of that. But Beit Hillel say no. The variation on what the Gentiles use is really not a variation anybody uses, and therefore it'll be permitted. Beit Shammai savre gazlinan kinuyim mishum kinuyim. Ubeit Hillel savar lo gazlinan kinuyim mishum kinuyim. This is a whole different understanding. It has nothing to do with whether it's a language the Gentiles created, the language the rabbis created, or it doesn't really matter. It's just a matter of these kinuyim are decided they're going to be forbidden for whatever reason, whichever way you go with it. But maybe a kinui of that. Now, a kinui of that is clearly not a problem, not according to anyone. But Beit Shammai forbids it because they say, if you use the language of a kinui, and we say, oh, that's not a vow, then you might come to think that a kinui itself is not a vow. And therefore, you might make a vow in that way and then say, oh, I don't really need to keep it. It's not a valid vow. So Beit Shammai were just stringent and said, let's forbid the kinui of a kinui so that you don't come to think that the kinui is permitted. But he is permitted and forbidden here, meaning that it's a valid vow and you have to keep to it versus it doesn't mean anything. And Beit Hillel say, no, we don't make a gzera like that. There's no reason, right? We don't worry. Kinui, everyone knows is a vow, but kinui of a kinui, no one's going to think if we say that's not a vow, that people are going to think a kinui is not a vow. And then it has nothing to do with this machloket at all. Now they want to know what we've been wondering, which is hechidami kinuyim de nedarim. So you would have expected a bit of an explanation, like where would we get to this kinui from? But instead they say these even crazier words, and that's why this is a little bit of a strange sugya. They're going to say all sorts of random words, not so random, but some of them are closer to the wording of the Mishnah. So if we take konam, konach, and konas. So now look at this. V'tane Rabbi Yosef, mekan mena, which is konam, but in a different use of the root konam, mekan mena. Mekan chena, which is konach, but with a different use of it. Mekan sena, right? Those are kinuyim of nedarim. Those at least are very close. These two, hechidami kinuyim de cherem, tane mafsha, which is kind of funny because we're having all these strange wording, and then we have this tane mafsha, which is a bit of a strange word. In fact, they struggle with this. Is this person's name? Is it the name of a place? And it's talking about someone in mafsha said this. It's a word that you don't really see otherwise in the Gemara. Anyway, charakim, charafim. They took harap, cheref, and they turned it into plural. That would be a kinui for cherem. Kinuyim de nazirut. What is that? Tani Rabbi Yosef, mechazkena, minazkena, mefichna. Here they take, the root is not exactly the same, because we have, let's say, paziach, and they say mefichna, the zayin is disappeared, or nazik, and they say mechazkena. It's not exactly, it's a little bit switching around the letters. I don't know how they got to these words. Ibayilhu, mipachzena mai, mitachzena mai, mitaznena mai. Okay, what if you change it a little bit more? What about those? Amarle Ravina le Rabashi. You can already, I probably guess what the answer is going to be to these questions. Kinma mai. This is a funny one. When you say kinma, did you mean konam, which has the root of kinma, or dilma kinman bosem, or did you mean cinnamon? Okay, the spice cinnamon, because that's also kinma with a nun at the end. So, or did you mean kinman bosem kama? Is that what you were saying? Amalei Rav Acha Beredu Rav Achia le Ravashi. Kina mai. What if you say the word kina? Does it mean kina shel tarnagolim kamar? Do you mean a nest of roosters? O dilma lashon de konam tibai, or is kina like a shortened version of konam, just missing the mem? I'm sorry, or lashon de konam, period. To which they say tibai. Tibai means we don't have an answer. It's like the teku, right? You probably guessed that. Here's a list of all these questions. What about this word? What about that word? And we don't know. Kinuyim de shavua hechidami. What's a kinui of a shavua? To which they say, shavuel, shavutiel, shakukael. Okay, because from shavuka, right? They had shavuka before in the Mishnah, so shakuka, right? They changed it a little bit. Shavuel, they say, what are you talking about? Shavuel can't be a kinui of shavua because shavuel ben Gershom mashma. Okay, he happens to be the name. Okay, we already got to these crazy. It happens to be a name of someone that's listed in Divrei Hayamim in Chronicles. There's all these listed names. His name is, right, he's listed as Shmuel ben Gershom. That's someone's name. That's not a kinoi of a shvua. To which they change it to Ella, Shavuva El, Shavutiel, Shakukael. Okay, what if you say it like that? Ma. Amar Shmuel, Amar Shmuel, Shmuel, got a little confused by all these words. Amar Shmuel, Amar Ashivta, lo Amar Klum, Ashkika, lo Amar Klum, Karishna, or maybe Karisna, lo Amar Klum. Okay, these words definitely do not connote. Again, you have Shmuel where all sorts of things that people might think are Shvuah. No, this is not a Shvuah. Remember, he always says you have to say this also, you have to say that also, you have to be more clear. This is not a clear language. What to do with this sugya is a great question. I see people ask, don't you have to mean what you say and all that? It's very hard to figure out. Oh, thank you for pointing that out about Shmuel ben Gershom is the grandson of Moshe Rabbeinu. That's right. Son of Gershom, his son. Okay. So anyway, very hard to understand what to do with this. Did these words, were they in use at the time? Were they not in use at the time? Are they talking about real words? Are they talking about not? We don't really know. It's really hard to know. It's one of the things that makes Nedarim a difficult Masechet in the sense of it's all based on language, which language changes throughout time. And we're having people discussing different generations, right? Where they weren't, right? They didn't all speak the same language. They didn't all have the same jargon. So it's hard for them, and therefore hard for the Rishonim, and therefore hard for us. So it's all kind of challenging. Nadar b'mohi arei elu kinuyim tanya rashba gomer haomer b'mohi lo amar klum. If you just say b'mohi, that doesn't mean anything. B'mumata da'amar mohi harei elu kinuyim d'shvuah. In the momata is the language of shvuah. Say the shvuah that Moshe took, then that would be a kinui of a shvuah. So by itself, it doesn't really work, okay? Because b'm Moshe doesn't mean anything. You could say anything about Moshe. Right? Some people think mohi is actually like a mumata, comes from that word and not from Moshe Rabbeinu. There's a debate about it. Next, Mishna. Haomer, and with this Mishna we'll finish. Haomer lachulin she'ochalach. Now, lachulin, okay, Aramaic, a lot of words get merged. So mufrashni mimcha meant mufrash ani, but it came out as one word, mufrashni. That was in the first Mishna. This is a word that's considered, if you say it with a la, with a patach underneath, la chulin is lo chulin, because lo in Aramaic, la is lo, not, so it's not chulin. Chulin is non-sacred. If you say not chulin, you mean sacred, meaning sacrifice. So if you say not chulin, meaning it is korban, basically, it's the opposite of korban, shochalacha, then you basically said a language of a neder. What I will eat from you, any of your food, is going to be for me a korban. Lo kasher, which basically means, right, your food for me is not kosher. That basically means I'm not going to eat it. Lo dechi, which is the language of purity, not pure, or tahor. Pure, it means not pure. You have to have the lo goes on both those words. Say not pure, whether you say in the language of dechi or tahor. You're basically saying your food is not pure for me. That means I'm not going to eat it, even though theoretically I could eat non-pure food. By using a language that's a negative, right? I'm not going to, it's not pure for me. It's as if you're treating it like a sacrifice, and a sacrifice that's not pure will be, you can't eat. Tamei no taru pigul. So three things, if it happens to the korban, it becomes tamei, impure. If it gets left over beyond the designated time that sacrifice can be eaten, there's different sacrifices that have different amount of times, can't be eaten. If you eat it, you get karet. Pigul is if you have the wrong intent while you're slaughtering, for example, or doing any of the four avodot of the korban, which we'll get to all this in Zvachim, and you have intent that you're going to either sprinkle the blood in the wrong place or in the wrong time, or, right, let's say outside the Beit HaMikdash, or tomorrow, which you're not allowed to do, or that you're going to eat it beyond the designated time, that makes the korban pigul. Okay, and then if you eat it, it's isur karet. Okay, it's serious, although it depends which one it is. One is karet, one is just forbidden. Either which way, if you say that, if I say that your food is going to be for me, tami no tar pigul, it's us. Now, ki imra, like the sheep, kidirim, like the pen, which has the sheep that are supposed to be sacrificed, like the eitzim, like the wood that burns on the altar, like ishim. Now, you didn't say on the altar, but you just used all these terms that relate to like the fires on the altar. Kamizbeach, like the altar. Kayechal, like the hechal, which has the altar, right, which is where we do the sacrifices. I mean, whatever, the Mizbeach is outside the altar, but other things go on in there. Ki Yerushalayim, like the city of Jerusalem, where has the temple in it, and the sacrifices are brought there. Or Nadar be'echad mikol ma shem Mizbeach. You made a neder using any language of anything that was used on the altar, like the spoons and the pans and everything like that. Afa b'shelo iskir korban, even though you didn't mention anything of the word korban, harei ze nadar b'korban. You basically took on a neder b'korban because all these words relate to korbanot, even though theoretically some of them could relate to other things, but we assume we're talking about a korban. Rabbi Yehuda seems to disagree, although we'll see in the next daf a bit of a different reading of the Mishnah. Rabbi Yehuda seems to disagree about one thing, because Yerushalayim has so many connotations, not just about the temple and sacrifices, but could mean you mean the trees, the stones, something else in Jerusalem, and therefore it would be a meaningless statement. So he seems to disagree with Tanakama. Tomorrow's daf will see that maybe he actually is Tanakama, and the whole Mishnah could be read in a bit of a different, or at least that element could be read, his line could be read a little bit differently. But we'll have to wait till tomorrow to see that, till tomorrow's daf. Wishing everyone a Shabbat Shalom. And actually tomorrow's daf will go up in a little bit, so you won't have to wait too long. Shabbat Shalom.